Hi. Welcome to this session at Festival of Work. I hope you're having a really good time. I'm really pleased that we've got this Fireside Chat. It's such an important topic, I think, for everybody, but particularly for people professionals. How can the profession best support their own well-being? So I'm Rachel, and I lead on health and well-being in the public policy team at the CIPD. And I'm really delighted to introduce Liggy Webb. Liggy is an award-winning and best-selling author, 35 books to her name so far. She's an international consultant. She's worked with so many different organisations on creating happier, healthier, more productive workplaces as well. Her full bio is on the website, so do go and have a look. So we're going to be having a conversation, but we want to introduce your questions to the conversation as well. So please do put them forward through the online platform. But just to introduce the topic very briefly for us first. We know that people professionals feel a real sense of responsibility for looking after people in the workforce. And it does mean sometimes the nature of your role, it can mean navigating some challenging situations that can be complex, that can be emotional, that can also put you in a position where you're balancing the needs of the organisation, but also its people. And that can feel like a very tense position to be in. And also, we're living in very turbulent times still. It's intense at work, but also in many people's lives as well. We also know that in the HR profession, there's a great sense of purpose, a real investment in the role. You really care. And although that's very rewarding, we also know from research that the jobs where you are investing a lot, they can also give rise to a lot of stress, potentially, and burnout. And very often our own health and well-being can take second place or get overlooked. So this is what we're going to focus on now. And we have got such an expert to discuss these issues with us. So do bring your questions forward. I can see I've got one already. But first of all, just as an opener, Liggy, why is it important right now for us to look after our own health and well-being?
Well, I think we're certainly living in a very challenging world. I've heard it being described as a polycrisis. You know, there is so much going on in the world right now that I think we don't know whether we're coming or going. And I certainly notice in the work that I do that people are speeding up. We experience something called information anxiety, where we are just totally overwhelmed with so much. And I think there is a danger that when we're on the go all the time, that we don't take enough time to check in on ourselves. Because self-care is giving the world the best of you, not what's left of you. And I think there is a danger sometimes that because we're in the caring profession, you know, we're looking after people, we don't necessarily always balance that out with looking after ourselves. So I think it's about that kind of self-awareness, but also being mindful of the fact that we're in a world that is stimulating us all the time. It's distracting us. So really important that we do kind of focus on ourselves, because the best that we can give to everybody else really is, you know, about looking after ourselves and being role models.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I've come on quite a long road myself in understanding when I am stressed or where things are beginning to tip over. I think it wasn't really until the pandemic where things sort of built up that I started to understand that, you know, I'm not feeling well and I need to do something about it. But I didn't always recognise it. How can we start to recognise what our triggers are for stress and recognise that this is stressful in terms of how I'm feeling?
Well, first of all, I think we all need to slow down a bit. My dad actually always used to say to me, if you want to go a bit faster, slow down. Yeah. And I think that is absolutely priceless advice. It really is, because we are in the busy ages. So first and foremost, it is about just slowing down. It's about pacing ourselves, because this is very much about, you know, we talk a lot about resilience, but we also need to talk a lot about endurance. I think that's something that's really important. So raising self-awareness and just being very much in tune with ourselves, because when we get stressed, we don't give the world the best of us. Very often we start to get, micromanage, we might get irritable, we might end up having, issues with various relationships in our lives. So it's really important that we are aware of that build-up of stress, because burnout is insidious. And sometimes we're just not even aware that we're at that point where, it only takes one thing to happen and then it pushes us into quite a bad space.
Yeah, it can really be that fine balance, I think. And everybody's got a tipping point, haven't they? Now, I think it will be unique to everybody in terms of how you perceive that pressure and that stress building up. How can we start to sort of build a healthy habit around how we live in terms of, because I think I am now so sort of conscious about day to day, how I manage demands and so on. And I really do build in things like swimming, knitting. These are the things that they sound simple, but they really do help me to keep well. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be complicated, does it?
It definitely doesn't need to be complicated. And actually knitting is, there's a lot of science behind the benefits, the health benefits of knitting, because it's a very kind of mindful activity. And absorption is something that is really key for our well-being. So any kind of activity that you have in your life that helps you to be present, but it's also as well helping you to be creative as well. Yeah. So if in doubt, get knitting or any kind of crafting. That's something that, can be helpful. Learning to play a musical instrument, all of those things, are really good. But to your point about it doesn't need to be complicated, I think if there is one message around well-being and self-care that I would absolutely, definitely recommend to everybody, and that is keep it simple. It really doesn't need to be complicated. I think one of the kind of dangers right now with well-being, since the pandemic, it's catapulted well-being onto centre stage. It is being highly commercialised, and I think there is a lot of stuff out there that is very complex, looks very sophisticated, but actually as human beings, we need to get the fundamentals in place. We need to make sure that we're resting, that we build in and prioritise rest time into our daily schedule. We need to make sure that we get outside and we get some fresh air. Nature is free, and if we're not careful, sometimes we don't get outside. We don't really make the most of it. We need to make sure that we're drinking lots of water. I would definitely say that's right at the top of my list. I'm absolutely religious about drinking 2 litres of water a day because it's liquid energy. Making sure that we're eating properly, making sure that we're getting good quality sleep. That is something that is really key. So all of those things, in a nutshell, they're very simple things, but often we don't always look at the basics, and I think that's really important.
And I know I'm really bad at drinking water, but I know that I must put that right. So it is, I think, coming back to those fundamentals, definitely. It kind of leads us on to another area that I think a lot of us struggle with. I do, and that's around boundaries. How can we maintain healthy boundaries between work and home? And I know sometimes there isn't always a firm separation because we don't sort of shrug off everything in our personal lives when we start working, and vice versa. But it is still really important, isn't it, to have separation? How can we best build those healthy boundaries?
Boundaries are a sign of self-respect. And I think if you don't respect your own boundaries, why should you expect anyone else to? And there's one message I would share here with everybody. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. And I think that's a good point to take away, because what we tend to do, and particularly in the caring profession, you want to help people, you want to be able to support people, but if that's to the detriment of your own well-being, in the longer term, you're not going to be able to support those people. So you have a kind of duty to yourself to make sure that you do put those boundaries in place. And it's not always about saying no, it might be saying yes, but on my terms. And if you don't know what your terms are, then it's going to be really difficult to communicate those boundaries. But I can't begin to emphasize how important putting in place healthy boundaries are.
That's really good advice. I've got a question here, and it really is an important one, I think, about the role of people professionals. Who can best advocate for the mental well-being of people professionals, especially when some feel it's not okay to say they're not okay? And I think this reads across to what I mentioned when I was opening the session about that sort of unique role that people professionals are in, sort of sometimes perhaps caught between the organisation's needs, the needs of the workforce, but also always having to maintain that professionalism, not being able to perhaps share as freely.
Yeah.
So what do you think they can do in that situation?
Right. The individual.
Yeah. Who can best advocate, or is it themselves?
Yeah, I think first of all it is about self-abdication for sure. It's like knowing what your limits are and having the confidence to be able to communicate that. Because I see way too many examples of people just powering on. Their perception is that, they have to do this, I need to do this. We need to kind of change that narrative. We choose to do whatever we do. And sometimes it is about having the confidence and being assertive and being able to push back. And I guess that comes to knowing yourself, knowing what your limits are, and then being able to communicate those in the most constructive way that you can. I think also, in the roles that we have with caring and supporting others, it's really reaching out and getting that peer support as well. Because if you're in an organisation and you feel that you're kind of isolated on your own, it's reaching out to people in other organisations. The more that you can network, the more collaboration, I think that helps us to build our confidence and share best practice as well.
I think that's a really important point, and I think you've more or less answered the next question around some recent research somebody mentions, where an important finding is that those who are better supported at work have better mental health, and what support should organisations be putting in place specifically for HR. But I think what you mentioned around the peer support, and that can be outside the organisation as well, can't it?
Yeah, definitely. There's some really great stuff that's going on out there. I've observed some really good examples. So I think the more that you can connect with each other, today's a great opportunity. If you don't know the person sitting next to you, have a quick chat afterwards and find out what's going on in other organisations. Because together, I think we can make a real difference, definitely.
Because the HR community is a big community, and many might be experiencing similar situations and so on. And I think the value of peer support, there's a lot of evidence, I think, showing how protective it can be for your well-being. We've also got resources and support if you're a CIPD member, so do look out for those on our website. Another question here. Kind of a comment as well. Rather than focusing on the symptoms of negative well-being, shouldn't we be using our professional expertise in designing environments where this doesn't happen? And that's from Emily. And I think it's a good point, isn't it? That we don't exist on our own in isolation in organisation. It should be a whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. And who is that,
Emily?
Yeah, Emily, you're absolutely 100% bang on there, because we need to be creating a culture, in every sort of organisation, creating a culture of well-being. So we need to be able to create that environment, because that's how we can support and help people to flourish and do their jobs really well.
And I think in many cases it will be you as people professionals who are leading, or at least playing a very major role in helping to design a health and wellbeing framework and the wider culture as well. And then there's another question, an important one, around the role of management. So it's, what advice would you give to middle managers who have to manage the expectations and emotions of senior leaders, which can be challenging, and how that impacts both them and the team they manage? And that's from Melanie.
Well, I completely empathise with the role of the middle manager. I know from my own past experience of being in that role, you are sandwiched between the two, and there are a lot of demands. And I think, again, this is where we need to have open and confident communication, where, it's okay to not be okay. I think there's a danger sometimes when you're in that position that you feel, first of all, that you've got to be okay all the time and you've got to kind of project that. And secondly, that it's your job to fix everyone, which it isn't. It's nobody's role to fix people. It's more about creating that environment where people can help themselves. And I would say that my top tip there is about honest, open communication, rather than just accepting it and thinking, well, that's just part of the role. It's having the confidence to communicate that, there is too much pressure, or can we kind of share the load, or can we explore different ways that we can support each other?
Yeah, it's really sound advice. Another really good question from Becky. What should someone who is feeling triggered by an employee's struggles do to ensure they are supporting themselves as well as the employee?
I think, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And when we're involved with people who perhaps have challenges, we also have to remember that takes an amount of energy from us. We can actually physiologically catch other people's moods. It's known as neural mirroring. And I think we have to be very aware that when we're in that space, if we're feeling quite drained, we then need to kind of recuperate from that as well. So it's identifying what we can do. Again, having conversations with your line managers, but also looking for the support that's available. A lot of employee assistance programs have fantastic resources that don't get used. There's a lot of support, counselling. So I would definitely encourage people to have a look and see what is available. And again, peer support. If you haven't got your own answers, reach out to people in other organisations. What kind of experiences have they had and what kind of support are they getting?
Yeah, I mean, again, just really sound advice. And it's not a sign of weakness to seek support, is it?
Absolutely not.
It took me a long time, years in fact, to really understand that and reach out myself when I was really struggling. It was hard. It's an act of courage, actually.
Yeah,
to share and.
Yeah, it's an absolute act of courage. And I think the key thing as well about that, if you do that, if you're courageous and being open about your own vulnerabilities, your own fragilities, the chances are that you're going to help and encourage other people to do the same. We're all struggling in life. It's a tough old world out there. And by being honest and being open and putting your hand up sometimes and saying, look, I'm not okay, it's going to help other people. It's about authenticity and humility as well.
It really is. And no matter what the issue is or what you're struggling with, and I mentioned earlier about those complexities that many of us are juggling in our personal lives as well. If you make it easier to talk about one topic, like say mental health, then it's easier to talk about other potentially sensitive, challenging issues as well.
Yeah.
It's the culture, isn't it? And
yeah,
we all play a part in that, don't we?
We are the culture.
We are the culture. Yeah, and it's a step-by-step, drip by drip process, isn't it? It's all those human exchanges. Another question here about that unique role that people professionals play, and it is: do you feel that organisations understand the impact of people work and what responsibility can leaders take to support their people professionals in the workplace? And that's from Amanda. It's quite a thought-provoking question.
That is a very thought-provoking question. Can you repeat that
quite
question?
Hard to
Sorry,
answer.
I didn't.
Do you feel that organisations understand the impact of people work?
Right, I would say some do and some don't. I see examples where absolutely the culture is incredible. And where I see an incredible culture of well-being, pretty much 99.9% of the time, it's when you've got senior leaders who are role modelling, senior leaders who are actually demonstrating self-care, looking after themselves. I think that's absolutely essential. The organisations where I see it not working and maybe quite a lot of money being wasted is where people simply aren't walking their talk. So, really key that right from CEO all the way through definitely needs to be, role modelling well-being.
And I think it does call into question the role of leaders as well, doesn't it? so important that leaders are on boards, and if they can be authentic
Yes.
and show their vulnerability, because I think in this country the sort of standard model of leadership has often been quite tough, not necessarily compassionate.
Yeah.
And I think it's where leaders again can have that compassion, show that vulnerability. I think that gives permission to HR, but to everybody in the organisation as well. So I think leaders do have to step up as well. And then just going a bit further around the role of HR professionals, because Liggy, you've mentioned already about the importance of role models. How important do you think it is that HR really takes on that mantle of being a healthy role model? And how can they do it in practice?
I think it's essential for all of us to be role models. You know, the better example that we set, then that helps to encourage other people. But one thing I would really emphasize here, that being a role model around well-being is not about being perfect. You know, I have quite a few conversations about this, and people say, oh, I live this, super perfect life. I don't. Well-being is my 24/7 role, literally, but I don't live a perfect life. I like to think I do about a kind of 80-20, 80% of the time I'm doing the good stuff, but 20% of the time I have bad days. I have days where I get imposter syndrome. I think lots of people experience that. I get social anxiety, all sorts of different things. So we have to remember we are human beings, and we were not born to be perfect. We were born to be real. And I think that's really important. And that's something from an HR perspective. You're a human being. So if you feel that you've got to be perfect, the chances are you're putting on this facade. And when we put on facades, that is incredibly stressful. So my advice is be real. Absolutely, but strive for the 80-20. I think that's a pretty good thing to strive for.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area, being a role model, and I've examined this quite a lot myself, because I lead on health and wellbeing at the CIPD, and I realise that I can't be perfect, but I can be myself as much as possible. But I do feel a bit more responsibility. So just for example, around sending emails, I thought it was okay, years ago, I'd send an email. And I thought, well, if I have a disclaimer just saying, I'm sending this out of office hours, but I don't expect you to reply, but it suits me and my working pattern. I mean, that can be all right. But I thought, well, actually, that person is still receiving that email out of work hours. And actually, we shouldn't be encouraging people to work outside working hours. So, I've really thought quite carefully about that, because I think it is important.
Can I just add something there? There's something I've been observing recently, and I found this quite interesting. The way that we're living in a world where it's all about instant gratification, there's lots of demands, someone sends an email or a message and they kind of want it immediately. It's almost like we become a bit addicted to speed, literally. And so I think what we really need to do is be very mindful of the kind of energy that we send out. So if we're somebody that is a little bit addicted to the stress, even the adrenaline rush that we get about working quickly, we've got to be really responsible for how that impacts on other people. And that's something I must admit that I check in personally about, is doing things at pace. Because I know that, when I'm kind of doing work, I can fire an email, want something back quite quickly. But we've got to be responsible for how that impacts on other people. Does anybody find that? Does anybody wave of hands that people are seeing the world's speeding up and there's sort of more demand? Yeah, definitely. So we are all responsible for that. We can either jump on the bandwagon and make everything faster and a bit more crazy, or we can start to pace ourselves. So being responsible for the energy we put out, I think, is really key.
And there's a really good final question from Steph around that I'll come on to at the end. But there are a couple of questions that are quite interesting, again, around the role of HR professionals, about whether there should be supervision for them. Joe says clinicians get supervision on a regular basis to support their well-being. Should HR get it too, given the nature of their work? I mean, it's quite an interesting...
I think that's a really interesting one to put out there and open up that conversation, because I think any support that we can get, the better.
Yeah, because if you think about the role of mental health first aiders, they should get, where you are exposed to very emotionally charged, distressing situations, then there should be some kind of framework to support people. So I think, that's an interesting question to pose. So thank you both. And then something about data. What do you consider, this is from Amanda, what do you consider the best metrics and the ways to measure our well-being? That's quite a big question, isn't it?
It's a big question, yeah. In terms of the best ways, it would be very difficult without understanding the uniqueness of each organisation, because every organisation operates differently. But I certainly think sickness absenteeism is, it's a very obvious one, and employee engagement surveys. But I also think there needs to be some metric built in with the line manager role, because the line manager's role is absolutely pivotal. The report that you wonderfully did with Simply Health, I mean, one of the key things that was identified was that stress-related illness, there was a big impact on management style. And I thought that was really, really eye-opening. So I think that anything that can be incorporated to focus a bit more on the relationship between the line manager and the individual, however that's done. I'm sure that there's some wonderful people out there that will think of quite creative ways to be able to do that. But I think if we could build in a metric that focuses on that, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I do. I mean, line managers, they are so central, aren't they, to well-being. They're the golden thread if they've got the right support, training, guidance and so on in place, because there is so much expectation on them. And then we've got 2 minutes. This is a really nice question from Steph for both of us really to finish up, but I'll hand it to you first, Liggy. What are your well-being, with our well-being and resilience, what are our top tips for encouraging routine that work for both of us? So how do we look after ourselves, I think?
So how do people in the
and how do you and how do I? Well, how do you and I really approach our well-being? I think.
Right. Okay.
Top tips.
So top tips. See self-care as an absolute priority. As I said before, self-care is giving the world the best of you, not what's left of you. So we're doing everybody a favour when we look after ourselves, because we can be role models. I think that's really key. So I guess that leads me on to the second one, which is about boundaries. Really understanding what your own kind of limits are, and that's being very aware of your own stress levels. Feel the rise every day, because we get that rise of stress, and constantly be checking in and making sure that you are really sort of building that time in and having those boundaries and having that confidence. And the third tip, collaborate with others. It's so powerful to have that connectivity with other people, to be able to empathise with others, to be able to listen and learn from each other. And I would say, particularly in the roles that you're in, by supporting each other and creating those peer groups, it will be really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I can really identify with everything you've said, Liggy, for me. Particularly as well, something you said earlier about it doesn't have to be immediate. I used to be very... feel compelled to answer things straight away, to deal with things straight away. But now I breathe and I pause, and not everything has to be answered in real time. So that's a really key one for me. And I think also making sure I do those self-care things outside work that I know keep me well, and take breaks. So that I can have that healthy boundary and just make it habitual day to day. So, we've come to the end. We could have carried on talking for ages. Thank you so much for all your questions. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Liggy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.